The question was simple enough. Name something every child dreams of doing. But when 8-year-old Zoe Martinez whispered her answer into the microphone, her words would stop, Family Feud mid-recording, and create the most unforgettable moment in game show history. What she said next didn't just break Steve Harvey's heart, it changed how an entire studio saw what it means to dream. It was a Wednesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The energy was electric as always, with two families ready to compete for the $20,000 grand prize. The Martinez family from San Antonio faced off against the Williams family from Detroit. Standard setup, standard questions, standard laughs. Steve Harvey was in his element, working the crowd with his signature blend of humor and warmth. But in the Martinez family lineup, something was immediately different. 8-year-old Zoe sat in a bright pink wheelchair at the end of the family podium, her long black hair decorated with colorful ribbons that matched her purple dress. She was the youngest contestant that day, brought by her older sister, Carmen, who was old enough to compete. Despite being confined to her wheelchair since birth due to spina bifida, there was something remarkably vibrant about Zoe's presence. Steve had noticed Zoe immediately during the family introductions. There was something about kids in wheelchairs that always drew his attention, maybe because he understood what it meant to face challenges that others couldn't see. Maybe it was the way they observed everything with those bright, determined eyes that seemed to hold dreams too big for their circumstances. And who do we have here? Steve had asked during introductions, kneeling down to Zoe's level, as he always did with younger contestants. "I'm Zoe," she had replied brightly, her voice clear and confident despite her small stature. "Zoe, and how old are you, sweetheart?" 8 years old, Mr. Steve. 8 years old, and what do you want to be when you grow up? Zoe had paused then, looking directly into Steve's eyes with an intensity that caught him off guard. "I want to be a runner," she said simply, her words carrying a weight that silenced the studio audience for just a moment. The audience had let out a collective "ah," and Steve had smiled that warm smile that had endeared him to millions. But something in Zoe's tone, something in the way she said runner with such absolute certainty, made him look at her just a moment longer than usual before moving on to the next family member. The game progressed normally for the first 2 rounds. The Martinez family had taken an early lead with some solid answers, and Steve was in his element, working the crowd, making jokes, and creating those moments of connection that made Family Feud more than just a game show. Zoe participated enthusiastically, clapping and cheering for her family from her wheelchair, her face lighting up with every correct answer. But during the 3rd round, everything changed. The category was things every child dreams of doing. It seemed innocent enough, the kind of question that typically generated answers like riding a bike or going to Disneyland. Carmen, Zoe's teenage sister, had just given the #1 answer, flying like a superhero. The family was celebrating their chance to play for the points. Steve was working his way down the family line, asking each member for their answers. When he reached Zoe, he knelt down beside her wheelchair with that easy smile, ready for whatever cute answer an 8-year-old might give. "All right, Miss Zoe," Steve said warmly. "Things every child dreams of doing. What do you think?" Zoe looked up at him, her dark eyes suddenly serious. The studio lights caught the small silver cross she wore around her neck, a gift from her grandmother. She paused for a moment longer than usual, and the studio audience waited expectantly. "Running," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that everyone in the studio felt but couldn't quite understand. Steve's smile didn't fade immediately. He was a professional. "Running," he repeated, turning the board. "Survey says." The board revealed that running wasn't among the surveyed answers. Normally, Steve would have moved on with a joke, maybe something about how running was exercise, and kids usually tried to avoid that. But something stopped him. Something in the way Zoe had said it, not with disappointment, but with such pure longing that it seemed to pull all the energy from the room. Steve looked back at Zoe and for the first time noticed that her hands were gripping the arms of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles were white. Not from nerves, he'd seen nervous contestants for decades. This was something deeper. "Zoe," Steve said gently, his voice softer now, "tell me about running." That's when the dam broke. Zoe's carefully maintained composure crumbled completely. The tears came first, then the kind of sobs that come from the deepest places of a child's heart. The studio fell completely silent. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone, contestants, audience members, even the production crew, was holding their breath. "I've never run before," Zoe whispered into the microphone, her voice breaking. "I've never even walked. I was born like this, and the doctors say I never will. But every night, I dream about it. I dream about running so fast that my hair flies behind me, and my feet don't hurt, and I can catch up to all the other kids." The silence in the studio was deafening. Steve Harvey, the man who had built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, was completely speechless. But what happened next is why Steve Harvey isn't just a game show host. He's a human being who understands that some moments transcend television. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Steve Harvey set down his cards right there on the studio floor, without saying a word to the production team, without asking for permission, without following any protocol. He walked over to Zoe's wheelchair. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. 300 audience members held their breath. "Zoe," Steve said, his voice now stripped of all performance, all entertainment value. This was just Steve Harvey, the man talking to a child who had shared her deepest dream. "Do you trust me?" Zoe looked up at him through her tears and nodded. "Then, let's go running." What happened next had never occurred in the history of Family Feud. Steve Harvey gently lifted 8-year-old Zoe from her wheelchair and cradled her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her small frame seeming almost fragile against his tall stature. But when she wrapped her arms around his neck, there was nothing fragile about her grip or the determination in her eyes. "Hold on tight," Steve whispered to her. "We're about to run the best race of your life." The camera operators continued filming, but by now everyone in the studio understood that they were witnessing something far more important than a game show. This was about dreams, about the power of imagination, and about what happens when someone decides to make the impossible possible, even if just for a moment. Steve began to move, not walking, but a gentle, rhythmic motion that simulated running. He carried Zoe around the perimeter of the studio, past the audience, past the family podiums, past the game board. As he moved, something magical happened. The entire Martinez family left their podium and followed behind Steve and Zoe, jogging alongside them. Then the Williams family, their competitors just minutes ago, abandoned their position and joined the procession. The audience began to stand and applaud, not the polite, prompted applause of a television taping, but a spontaneous, organic celebration of pure joy. "How does it feel, Zoe?" Steve called out as he carried her, his voice slightly breathless, but filled with joy. "How does running feel?" "Like flying," Zoe shouted, her tears now tears of laughter and pure happiness. "I'm running, Mr. Steve. I'm really running." Steve completed a full circle around the studio floor, carrying Zoe the entire way. When he finally stopped, both of them were breathing hard. Steve from the physical exertion, Zoe from the sheer excitement of her dream coming true, even in this impossible way. But Steve wasn't finished. Still holding Zoe in his arms, he turned to address the entire studio, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "today we witnessed something that doesn't happen on game shows. We witnessed the power of dreams. This little girl just ran her first race, and she won. She didn't just win the race, she won our hearts. The applause that followed wasn't television applause. It was something deeper, something that connected everyone in that studio to their own childhood dreams, their own moments of wonder, their own understanding of what it means to believe in the impossible. Steve gently placed Zoe back in her wheelchair, but before he stepped away, he did something that would become legendary in Family Feud history. He took off his suit jacket, the same navy blue jacket he wore for every taping, and draped it over Zoe's small shoulders. "This jacket has been with me for every Family Feud I've ever hosted," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's seen families win and lose, laugh and cry. But today, it's going home with someone who taught us all what real winning looks like. Because Zoe, what you did today wasn't just running. It was showing everyone in this studio that dreams don't have limits unless we put them there." The jacket was enormous on Zoe's small frame, hanging past her knees like a royal robe, but she wore it with the dignity of someone who had just accomplished something extraordinary. The symbol was clear to everyone in the studio. She wasn't just taking home a piece of clothing, she was taking home the respect and admiration of everyone who had witnessed her courage. "I want you to keep this," Steve continued, kneeling beside her wheelchair one more time. "And every time you put it on, I want you to remember that you are a runner. Maybe not in the way other people run, but in the way that matters most. You run toward your dreams instead of away from them. You run with your heart, your spirit, your imagination, and that makes you the fastest runner I've ever met." Zoe looked down at the jacket, then back up at Steve. "Does this mean I'm part of your family now?" Steve's composure, which he had maintained throughout this extraordinary moment, finally cracked. Tears flowed freely down his face as he reached out and took Zoe's small hand in his much larger ones. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but picked up clearly by his wireless microphone, "you've been part of my family since the moment you told me your dream." And family members support each other's dreams, no matter how impossible they might seem. The studio erupted then, not just in applause, but in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But this wasn't the orchestrated celebration of a television show. This was 300 people recognizing something sacred, something real, in a world that often felt manufactured. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something unprecedented happened again. Instead of dispersing, people lingered. Audience members approached Zoe to tell her how much her courage had inspired them. The Williams family, who had lost the game, came forward not with disappointment, but with hugs and words of encouragement. Mrs. Martinez, Zoe's mother, who had watched this entire scene unfold from the family podium, finally approached her daughter and Steve. Through her own tears, she managed to say, "Thank you for seeing her the way she sees herself." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, not a prop, but his actual personal card. He pressed it into Mrs. Martinez's hand. "This has my direct number," he said. "Not my manager, not my assistant, mine. Because what happened here today, that's not something that ends when the cameras stop rolling. Zoe is going to do amazing things in her life, and I want to be there to cheer her on." 6 months later, the impact of that day was still rippling outward. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to remove Steve's unprecedented decision to stop the game and carry Zoe around the studio. The response was unlike anything in game show history. The show received over 75,000 letters, emails, and social media messages from viewers sharing their own stories of overcoming physical challenges, of dreams that seemed impossible, and of moments when strangers became family. Many were from parents of children with disabilities, thanking Steve for showing the world that their children's dreams mattered too. Zoe Martinez became a regular guest on Steve Harvey's talk show, not as a curiosity or inspiration poster child, but as someone who had taught the world something about the power of imagination. She still wore Steve's jacket to every appearance, and he never asked for it back. The wheelchair that had initially seemed like a limitation became a symbol of possibility. Family Feud began partnering with children's hospitals and disability advocacy groups, creating moments where dreams could be celebrated regardless of physical limitations. Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of shows and met tens of thousands of contestants, said in interviews that Zoe's episode changed him as a host and as a person. "That little girl reminded me why I do what I do," he said. "It's not about the laughs or the entertainment value. It's about connection. It's about seeing people for who they are and who they dream of being. Zoe taught me that the most important race isn't about who's fastest. It's about who has the courage to keep dreaming." The jacket that Steve gave to Zoe became more than a garment. It became a symbol of possibility, of the moment when entertainment became ministry, when a game show host became a dream facilitator. Zoe had it displayed in her bedroom alongside photos from that day, and thank you letters from children around the world who had watched her run and decided their own dreams were worth pursuing. In his memoir, published 2 years later, Steve Harvey wrote about that day. "I've made people laugh for decades. I've created moments of joy and connection. But on that Wednesday in Atlanta, I learned something that changed everything. I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is help someone else's dream come true, even if just for a moment." Zoe didn't just run that day. She taught an entire studio full of adults how to fly. Today, Zoe is 10 years old and actively involved in adaptive sports programs. She races competitively in her wheelchair and has won several regional competitions. But more importantly, she speaks at schools and hospitals, sharing her story and encouraging other children with disabilities to pursue their dreams. The business card Steve gave her mother has been used many times over the years, not for favors or opportunities, but for the simple human connection that Steve promised that day. Every few months, Zoe calls just to tell Uncle Steve about her latest race or her newest dream. And Steve Harvey? He learned that sometimes the most important races happen when someone decides to carry another person toward their dreams. The microphone that he set down that day was picked up within minutes, but the impact of what happened when Steve Harvey stopped being a host and started being human continues to resonate. Because sometimes an 8-year-old girl's impossible dream can remind us all that the only real limitations are the ones we accept. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most beautiful thing you can do is help someone run toward their dreams, even if you have to carry them every step of the way. That's not entertainment. That's love in action. That's what happens when someone decides that making dreams come true matters more than following the script. And that's the legacy of the day when Steve Harvey stopped Family Feud and taught the world what it really means to run.